The cold came first, then the pressure, then the incision. I lay on the slab beneath vaulted stone that had absorbed centuries of blood and recited prayer. The air tasted of rendered fat and sterilization reagent. Somewhere above me, sensors swung on chains thick enough to moor ships, trailing smoke that made my eyes water even as I kept them fixed on the carved aquila overhead. The chirurgeon priest moved at the edge of my vision, his augmetic limbs clicking with the precision of devotional machinery. I did not turn my head. Movement had not been authorized. The temple's refit chambers existed 3 levels beneath the primary sanctum, accessible only during prescribed intervals when the Officio Assassinorum operational tempo allowed for maintenance of its instruments. I had been summoned 6 hours prior with a message that contained no explanations, only coordinates and a time. That was normal. Everything about this was normal. I had undergone 17 similar procedures across 12 years of active service, each one documented, each one necessary to preserve function in a body engineered beyond baseline human tolerance. The augmetic heart secondary nested against my 5th and 6th ribs had begun exhibiting flutter during my last deployment, a minor deviation logged automatically by my internal monitoring systems and transmitted during extraction. Now it would be replaced. Routine. Expected. A small sacrifice to remain what the throne required me to be. The chirurgeon priest began his recitation without preamble, his voice carrying the mechanical harmonics of vox-grafted vocal cords. The flesh is weak, yet through service it is made strong. The mind is clouded, yet through obedience it perceives truth. The soul is wayward, yet through suffering it finds purpose. I had heard these words before, always the same, their rhythm designed to synchronize with autonomic function and ease the body toward acceptance of trauma. I let my breathing match the cadence. My pulse slowed. The stone beneath me leached warmth from my bare skin, and I welcomed the cold because it meant I was still capable of sensation, still material enough to be repaired. He applied the first incision without anesthesia. The doctrine was clear on this point. Pain, refined focus, and an assassin's nervous system had been rebuilt to process agony as data rather than distress. I felt the scalpel part skin along the surgical line marked earlier in ritual ink, felt the deeper cut through subcutaneous reinforcement and the sealed muscle beneath. Blood welled and was immediately suctioned away by floating servo-cherubs, their infant faces blank and their wings beating in synchrony. The chirurgeon priest's mechadendrites worked in concert with his organic hands, peeling back tissue with the care of a craftsman attending to sacred parchment. I did not scream. Screaming would indicate malfunction. The defective augmetic was exposed, its casing slick with biological integration fluid. I could see it from the angle of my head, a fist-sized organ of brass and synthetic muscle grafted directly to the pulmonary artery. It still beat, faintly, out of rhythm with my primary heart. The priest paused, his augmetic eyes rotating to focus on the monitor banks arranged around the chamber. Neural stability within acceptable variance, he recited, as much for the record as for me. Proceeding to extraction. The removal took 11 minutes. I counted them by the pulse in my neck, the rhythm that remained uninterrupted even as the secondary system was disconnected and lifted free. There was a moment, brief and vertiginous, when my circulation depended entirely on biological function, when I existed in a state the Imperium considered dangerously human. Then the new augmetic was lowered into place, already blessed and anointed, its interfaces seeking and locking into prepared receptor sites. The connection was not gentle. I felt electricity arc through nerve clusters as machines synced with flesh, felt my chest cavity flood with warmth as the device initiated its operational cycle. My vision grayed at the edges. I kept my eyes on the aquila. The chirurgeon priest resumed his catechism. Through iron discipline, the weakness of flesh is constrained. Through faithful service, the error of will is corrected. Through necessary pain, the truth of the Emperor's love is made manifest. His hands moved with absolute precision, suturing layers, sealing interfaces, ensuring that no boundary between body and machine remained visible once healed. I was already producing the accelerated clotting agents that would close the wound within hours, already adapting to the new organ's rhythm. Everything was proceeding correctly. Then the fragment surfaced. It was not a memory in any conventional sense. I did not see images or hear words. Instead, I felt the texture of a moment that should not have existed in my recollection, a face lingering in my awareness, features I had catalogued and then filed beyond retrieval, yet now somehow present. The target had been confirmed heretical, their elimination sanctioned through channels I trusted without question. The kill had been clean. But the face remained, and with it a sensation I could not classify, the faint weight of hesitation that had occurred in the instant before the trigger. A pause measured in fractions of a second that should have been edited from my neural record during the standard post-mission purge. The chirurgeon priest's mechadendrites stopped moving. The servo-cherubs halted mid-air. I realized, with a clarity that cut deeper than the scalpel, that my biometric readings had shifted. Elevated limbic activity. Unapproved cognitive deviation. The priest leaned closer, his augmetic eyes whirring as they focused. "An anomaly has been detected," he said, his tone unchanged, as though announcing the weather. "Residual pattern persisting beyond authorized retention period." Noting for record, I wanted to speak, to explain that the memory had surfaced without volition, that I had not summoned it, that I remained compliant. But speech had not been authorized, and my training held. The priest consulted a data slate, his fingers moving across blessed keys. "Corrective measures are not indicated at this time," he continued, addressing the record rather than me. "Subject remains within functional parameters. Doctrinal assurances will be sufficient." He turned back to the surgical field, resuming his work with the same mechanical precision. "You serve the throne without flaw," he said, and it was both absolution and command. "The self that doubts has no place in your design. What remains is only what is needed." The suturing continued. The fragment faded, not erased but submerged, pressed down beneath layers of imposed certainty. I felt the moment seal over like skin closing across a wound, present but no longer accessible. By the time the final stitch was placed, my biometrics had returned to baseline. The priest stepped back, his work complete, and gestured for the servo-cherubs to cleanse the site. Blessed unguents were applied, hymns were chanted. I lay still and let the ritual conclude. When he finally spoke the closing words, they were the same words I had heard 17 times before, the phrase that marked the boundary between maintenance and redeployment. "You are fit for purpose." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, recorded in triplicate, sealed with his sigil and transmitted to the archives that tracked every instrument in the officio's care. I believed him because I had to, because doubt was a luxury afforded only to those who could afford to fail. But as I was lifted from the slab and escorted back toward the stasis chambers, still naked, still bleeding faintly through the sealed wound, I felt something I could not name. It was not pain. Pain had classification, purpose, resolution. This was something quieter, something that existed in the space between what had been adjusted and what I was permitted to know. I did not understand it. I did not resist it. I simply carried it with me, back into the cold and the waiting dark, where all things that served the throne eventually returned. The refit cycle concluded. I was declared operational. Orders would come, they always did, and I would obey them with the flawless precision that defined every moment of my existence, every breath, every calculated motion. I was an Imperial assassin, honed and sanctified, a weapon given thought only so that it might better destroy the enemies of mankind. This was not a burden. This was the highest calling. I knew this. I had always known this. And yet, the fragment remained. The stasis chamber sealed around me with a hiss of pressurized air and the faint metallic taste of preservation chemicals. I stood in the center of the cylindrical space, my bare feet cold against the deck plating, and let the restraints deploy from the walls. They locked around my wrists, my ankles, my throat not cruelly, but with the firm inevitability of a system designed to prevent movement during induced dormancy. The internal lighting dimmed to red, then amber, then vanished entirely. Darkness came, and with it, the low hum of machinery that would regulate my body's functions while consciousness ebbed. This was the shape of rest in the Officio Assassinorum. Not sleep, not comfort, simply the enforced absence of activity between deployments, a state engineered to preserve resources and prevent the deterioration that came from extended awareness without purpose. I had spent more time in stasis than in motion across the years, my life segmented into operational periods and dormant intervals, with nothing resembling personal time existing between them. I did not dream in stasis. The chemicals prevented that. What remained was a shallow, monitored blankness that the Medicae documentation referred to as optimal cognitive standby. But before the chemicals fully engaged, there was always a moment, brief, unavoidable, when my mind remained active within the restraints, when I existed in a liminal space between duty and nothing. In that moment, the training took hold. Catechisms rose unbidden, cycling through my thoughts with the automaticity of breathing. I did not choose to think them. They simply were. The foundation upon which every other thought had been constructed since the day I was taken and remade. I am the Emperor's instrument, shaped to his purpose and no other. I exist to remove that which must not remain. My hand is his will made manifest through precision. I have no name but the designation given. I have no desire but the mission assigned. I have no fear but the failure to serve. The words settled into my consciousness like sediment in still water, layer upon layer, until I could not distinguish them from my own thoughts. They were not imposed from outside. They were me. The truest version of me that existed, the self stripped of error and weakness, calibrated to function without hesitation. I found comfort in their recitation, the same comfort I had found in the ritual incisions, in the cold of the slab, in the absolute certainty of the Chirurgeon priest's declaration. I was fit for purpose. I was correct. Nothing else mattered. Except the fragment. It was still there, submerged but present. A texture at the edge of awareness that resisted the chemical tide. I could not see the face clearly anymore, could not recall the context of the mission or the nature of the target's heresy. Those details had been claimed by the standard neural scrubbing that followed every sanctioned kill, but the sensation remained, that faint, unapproved hesitation, the pause that should not have existed. It did not hurt, it did not distract. It simply was. A small anomaly logged in my own internal record, waiting. The chemicals deepened. My pulse slowed further. The restraints tightened fractionally as my body settled into stasis posture. I stopped resisting the pull toward dormancy and let myself sink into the prescribed blankness. The catechisms faded last, their rhythm slowing until only the core remained. I serve. I serve. I serve. Then nothing. Time did not pass in stasis so much as it was simply skipped, excised from experience and replaced with absence. When the chamber began its revival sequence, it felt like no time had elapsed at all, as though the sealing hiss and the reopening hiss were part of the same breath. But the chronometer embedded in my visual cortex reported differently. 4 weeks had passed. 28 days compressed into a single transition. My body maintained, my mind held in abeyance, my existence reduced to a set of monitored vitals and logged chemical balances. The restraints retracted. The lighting returned, harsh and white. I stood in the same position I had entered, my muscles unweakened by disuse because the stasis field prevented atrophy, my thoughts clear and unburdened by the residue of dreams. I was ready. I had always been ready. That was the design. A data courier cherub waited beyond the chamber door, its infant face serene, and its tiny hands clutching a scroll case marked with wax seals I recognized without needing to read. Orders. I took the case, dismissed the cherub with a gesture, and broke the seals with my thumb. The parchment inside was real, not synthetic, sourced from materials blessed on terra and inscribed by hand in the flowing script of a sanctioned scribe. Every word had been checked, verified, and authorized through channels that extended back to the temples of the officio, and, by extension, to the throne itself. The target was a planetary governor. The location was a world-designated Morning's Gate, currently in the final consolidation phase of a siege that had lasted 17 months. The heresy was administrative corruption severe enough to threaten tithe compliance and undermine morale among the besieging guard regiments. The method was unspecified, left to my discretion based on environmental factors and operational security. The timeline was absolute. Elimination to occur within 72 hours of planetfall, confirmation to be transmitted via encrypted astropathic relay immediately upon completion. I read the orders 3 times, committing every detail to memory, then burned the parchment in the consecrated brazier set into the chamber wall. The ashes were collected automatically, sealed, and archived. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was forgotten by the Imperium, even if individuals like me were designed to forget on command. Preparation began immediately. I moved through the temple's armory levels, requisitioning the tools appropriate for the mission profile. A hell pistol, compact and suppressed, gene-locked to my palm print and loaded with vengeance rounds designed to fragment within the target while leaving minimal external trauma. A monomolecular blade, 20 centimeters long, its edge maintained at the atomic level. Chameleoline body glove, reactive to ambient light and environment. Toxin capsules, 3 varieties, each calibrated for human biochemistry and designed to mimic natural causes. Climbing claws, rebreather, Auspex jammer. The weight of each item settled into place with the familiarity of limbs I had always possessed, their function integrated into muscle memory so deeply that thought was unnecessary. I did not choose this equipment. The mission profile chose it. I was simply the mechanism through which selection occurred, my training surfacing the correct options without conscious deliberation. By the time I reached the transit bay, I was no longer thinking in words at all. I was the mission, embodied and prepared, waiting only for deployment. The transit occurred in silence. I was secured in a shock cradle aboard a Valkyrie configured for low orbital insertion, alone except for the pilot and co-pilot who never turned to acknowledge my presence. The flight lasted 6 hours, the interior dark and cold, the only sound the steady drone of engines and the occasional automated announcement of altitude adjustments. I did not sleep. I did not review the mission. I simply waited, my mind clear, my body still, my augmetic heart secondary beating its new rhythm in perfect synchrony with the primary organ. Morning's Gate appeared through the viewport as a grey-green sphere mottled with the brown scars of war. Orbital bombardment had stripped the northern continent to bedrock. The southern hive cities still burned in places, their fires visible even from this altitude. The siege had been thorough. The Imperium did not tolerate defiance. I felt nothing looking at the destruction, not satisfaction, not sorrow, only the calm recognition that this world had required correction and correction had been delivered. My mission was simply a continuation of that process, a surgical removal of the final corrupted element so that healing could begin. The insertion was textbook. The Valkyrie descended through the atmospheric shell, buffeted by thermal updrafts from the fires below, and deployed me at altitude via gravchute. I fell in silence, the body glove active, my silhouette blending into the smoke-dark sky. The ground rose to meet me with the inevitability of all descents, and I landed in the ruins of a factorum district 2 kilometers from the governor's secured compound. The chute detached automatically, its silk igniting as it fell away, leaving no trace of my arrival. I moved through the ruins like water finding its path. The streets were empty, the population already evacuated or dead. Artillery had reduced most structures to skeletal frameworks, their steel bones exposed and twisted. I navigated by memory of the briefing holograms, each turn anticipated, each obstacle already mapped. Somewhere ahead, the governor waited in the fortified administrative complex that had been built to withstand siege and had succeeded, outlasting the city it was meant to govern. He would be surrounded by guards, servitors, and automated defenses. He he would feel safe. He was not. The infiltration took 9 hours. I did not rush. Haste introduced error, and error was unacceptable. I bypassed the primary perimeter using maintenance tunnels still intact beneath the rubble. I ascended through a ventilation shaft too narrow for a standard human, my augmented flexibility allowing passage where genetics alone would have failed. I waited in the crawl spaces between floors, listening to guard patrols, mapping their patterns with the patience of stone. When I finally reached the governor's personal quarters, it was 3 hours before dawn, the time when circadian rhythms were at their lowest ebb, when even trained soldiers struggled against the body's demand for rest. The kill itself was silent. A toxin capsule, injected through the gap between helmet and gorget of the guard stationed outside the governor's door. The man slumped without sound, his nervous system paralyzed before his brain could register alarm. I dragged him into a shadowed alcove, positioned him to appear merely resting, and moved to the door. The lock was genetic, requiring the governor's handprint. I had brought his handprint with me, or rather, a synthetic replica grown from tissue samples acquired weeks prior through channels I did not question. The door accepted the forgery without hesitation. Inside, the governor slept in a bed too large for one person, his body soft and pale against dark sheets. He looked older than his picked file suggested, his face lined with stress, his breathing labored. I moved to his bedside, the hell pistol already drawn, already aimed at the point where skull met spine. One shot, instant death, silent except for the faint crack of bone and the wet sound of impact. His body jerked once, then stilled. Blood spread across the pillow, dark and slow. I watched until the spreading stopped, until I was certain, then holstered the weapon and began the verification process. Retinal scan, gene sample, picked capture of the wound. All data uploaded to the encrypted astropathic relay node I had activated upon entry. The transmission lasted 7 seconds. The confirmation came back immediately. Target eliminated, mission complete, extraction authorized. I should have felt satisfaction. I felt nothing. This was correct. Satisfaction was not part of my design. But then the order came that was not part of the plan. The astropathic relay crackled with a secondary transmission, text only, bearing seals that indicated priority override. I read it twice, not because I did not understand, but because understanding brought no clarity. The order was simple: remain in position, do not extract, observe, no explanation, no context, no timeline for when the observation period would end. Just the command itself, absolute and unquestionable. I moved to the window, keeping to the shadows, and waited. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to gray to a sickly yellow. Somewhere in the compound, alarms began to sound, not immediate, not panicked, but the measured response of a security system detecting an anomaly on scheduled rounds. Guards would find their colleague. They would find the governor. Protocol would engage. I remained still, my camelioline active, my breathing controlled, and watched as the machinery of response began to turn. By mid-morning, the compound was sealed. Military personnel arrived, guard officers in formal dress, accompanied by administratum officials whose robes bore the sigils of the Departamento Munitorum. I observed from my position as they entered the governor's quarters, as they examined the body, as they spoke in low tones that I could not hear but could read through posture and gesture. They were not surprised. They were not outraged. They were procedural. Then the body was moved. Not immediately, but after documentation, after picked capture, after the officials had consulted data slates and made notations. The corpse was wrapped in blessed shrouds and carried away with the reverence due to any fallen servant of the Imperium. And in its place, within hours, another figure was brought into the quarters. I saw him clearly through the window, a man of similar age and build, his face reconstructed to match the dead governor's features, his movements uncertain as he was positioned in the bed and instructed by officials I could not hear. They were staging a replacement. The governor's death would be announced, but not yet. First, there would be a public appearance. a final address, a symbolic transfer of power that would smooth the transition and prevent panic among the siege survivors. The man I had killed would die again, this time in front of crowds, his execution carried out by commissariat decree for the corruption he had committed. The real death, the one I had performed, would be classified, redacted, erased from public record. My mission had been successful. The target had been eliminated, but the elimination had been rendered irrelevant except as a procedural step toward a larger orchestration. I had been the instrument of removal, but not the agent of justice. That role belonged to the theater being prepared below, to the replacement corpse and the officials who would script his public condemnation. I felt nothing. This was not confusion. This was simply information, processed and filed. But beneath the information, in the place where the fragment still resided, something shifted. Not doubt. Doubt would have required belief in an alternative. This was something smaller, a question that formed without words. If the kill was performed correctly, why did the method of death require alteration? I remained in position for 2 more days, observing as the officials rehearsed the public execution, as the replacement was coached through his performance, as the machinery of propaganda was assembled with the same precision I had used to infiltrate the compound. On the 3rd day, the astropathic relay delivered my extraction authorization. I left the way I had entered, through tunnels and shafts, across ruins and ash, to a designated extraction point where a Valkyrie waited with its engines already cycling. No one asked me what I had seen. No one acknowledged that I had remained beyond the mission parameters. I was simply retrieved, transported back to the temple, and directed to the cleansing chambers where ritual purification would remove the physical traces of the mission before stasis could be reinitiated. I submitted to the cleansing without resistance. Let the servitors scrub my skin with blessed oils. Let the priests chant the hymns of decontamination. Let the familiar rhythms carry me back toward the baseline state that preceded every mission and followed every conclusion. But as I entered the stasis chamber again, as the restraints deployed and the chemicals began their work, I carried the question with me. It had no urgency. It had no emotional weight. It was simply there, filed alongside the fragment, waiting in the space between what I had been told was true and what I had been permitted to see. The Imperium endured. The throne was served. The governor had been eliminated. Everything had proceeded correctly. And yet, the question remained. The black ship subvessel Absolute Penance was not designed for human comfort. I stood in the embarkation bay as the loading servitors processed my arrival, my body still adjusting to the transition from stasis to active deployment, and felt the weight of the ship settle into my awareness like a hand pressing down on my chest. The ceiling was too low, forcing even my modest height into a permanent stoop. The walls were too close, the corridors ahead narrowing to dimensions that suggested they had been built for cargo rather than crew. The air tasted of recycled sweat, machine oil, and the acrid tang of psychic dampening fields operating at levels that made my teeth ache. This was transit. Not deployment, not mission, simply the vast, empty interval between targets when I existed as inventory being repositioned. The Absolute Penance was one of hundreds of smaller craft that serviced the black ships themselves, ferrying secondary cargo supplies, penitents, assassins between systems where the great vessels could not easily dock. It had no windows, no natural light penetrated its hull. Time was marked only by the shift bells that rang at 8-hour intervals, their tone flat and mechanical, devoid of the sacred harmonics that graced proper Imperial vessels. I was assigned a cell, not quarters, 3 meters by 2, containing a slab bed bolted to the wall, a waste reclamation unit, and nothing else. The door sealed behind me with a magnetic lock that engaged automatically, imprisoning me for the duration of transit unless summoned for scheduled activity. I did not resist. Resistance would have indicated malfunction. I simply stood in the center of the cell, oriented myself to the dimensions, and began the meditative sequence prescribed for non-operational periods. The sequence was hypno-conditioned, designed to maintain neural plasticity without permitting genuine rest. I closed my eyes and let the internal counting begin, regulating my breath to the prescribed rhythm, allowing my thoughts to flatten into the shallow state the Medicae called active standby. In this state, I was neither asleep nor fully conscious, my mind present but not engaged, my body maintained at readiness without the deterioration that came from true idleness. The hours would pass, the ship would carry me. When arrival came, I would be prepared. But the sequence did not hold. 3 hours into the meditation, memory intruded, not the fragment from the refit that remained submerged, dormant, but something else, a sensory echo from a previous mission, surfacing without authorization. I felt the texture of cold stone against my palms, heard the sound of breathing that was not my own, tasted the particular dryness that came from recirculated air in a sealed bunker. The memory was incomplete, lacking context or sequence, offering only sensation divorced from meaning. I could not place the mission. I could not identify the target. I simply felt the echo, persistent and intrusive, disrupting the meditation rhythm. I opened my eyes. The cell walls pressed close, unchanged. My chronometer indicated that no significant time had elapsed. I closed my eyes again and resumed the sequence, forcing the rhythm back into place through sheer repetition. The echo faded. The meditation stabilized. I remained in standby for another 6 hours, undisturbed, until the shift bell rang and the cell door unlocked automatically. Scheduled activity was communicated via Data Cherub, a small servo skull that delivered instructions in clipped Gothic. I was to report to Chapel 7 for mandatory spiritual reinforcement. I dressed in the plain grey body glove provided for non-operational periods and followed the painted guide strips along the corridor floors, navigating by rote through passages that curved and branched with no apparent logic. Other figures moved through the corridors, penitents in shackles, servitors hauling components, crew members whose faces were hidden behind rebreather masks. None acknowledged my presence. I was a void to them, as they were to me. Chapel 7 was a narrow chamber barely large enough for the 40 souls compressed within it. I entered and took my position at the rear, standing shoulder to shoulder with others, whose designations I neither knew nor needed. At the front, elevated on a small dais, a confessor waited. He was old, his skin the color of parchment, his augmatic eye clicking as it rotated to survey the assembled. When he spoke, his voice carried the mechanized harmonics of a vox unit implanted too deeply, each word vibrating in the bones of my skull. "We are instruments," he began, and the congregation murmured the response without thought. "We are instruments." The call and response continued, cycling through the litany of service, each phrase reinforcing the foundational truths that bound us to the throne. I spoke the words without hearing them, my vocal cords producing the sounds automatically while my mind remained distant, observing rather than participating. This was not defiance. It was simply the state I existed in during rituals that had been repeated so many times they had lost the capacity to penetrate awareness. But then the confessor deviated from the standard litany. "The faithful servant does not question the shape of their service," he said, his augmetic eye locking onto me with a precision that suggested individual targeting. "The faithful servant does not linger on that which has been completed. The faithful servant does not permit the past to intrude upon the present." He paused, letting the words settle, then continued. "Memory is a burden. Memory is a distraction. Memory is the enemy of purity." I felt the weight of his gaze, felt the words directed not at the congregation but at me specifically, and understood with sudden clarity that this was not random spiritual instruction. This was correction. Somewhere in the ship's systems, my biometric data had been flagged. The intrusive memory, the disrupted meditation, these had been logged, analyzed, and assessed as deviations requiring remediation. The confessor was not here to inspire faith. He was here to adjust me back toward compliance. The rest of the sermon blurred into repetition. When it concluded, the congregation dispersed, and I was instructed via Data Cherub to report to Medical Bay 3 for scheduled hypno-conditioning. I followed the guide strips again, descending 2 levels deeper into the ship's core, where the air grew warmer and the sound of machinery louder. The bay was a sterile chamber dominated by a reclined chair equipped with neural interface clamps and an overhead apparatus bristling with injection ports. A medicae in sterile robes waited, her face obscured by a surgical mask, her hands already gloved. "Residual loyalty has been detected," she said without preamble, consulting a data slate. "Your neural activity during prescribed meditation exceeded acceptable variance. This indicates incomplete processing of previous operational data. Corrective conditioning is authorized." She gestured to the chair. I sat without hesitation, tilted my head back, and allowed the interface clamps to lock around my temples. The injection ports descended, their needles seeking the implant jacks at the base of my skull, and I felt the cold rush of chemicals entering my cerebrospinal fluid. The conditioning began immediately. I did not lose consciousness. Hypnoconditioning was not anesthesia, but my awareness narrowed to a tunnel, my thoughts constrained to the voice that began speaking through the neural interface. It was not the medicae's voice. It was synthesized, gender-neutral, inhumanly calm. It spoke in rhythm with my heartbeat, each word timed to coincide with autonomic function, bypassing conscious resistance and imprinting directly onto the structures that governed memory and response. "You serve the throne without flaw. You serve the throne without question. The past is sealed. The past is irrelevant. Only the mission matters. Only obedience matters. You are the Emperor's will, and his will does not doubt." The words repeated, varied slightly, repeated again. I could not count the cycles. Time dilated, stretched, became meaningless. My sense of self thinned, became translucent, and beneath it I felt the architecture of my conditioning being reinforced, not replaced, not altered, simply emphasized. The original programming made louder until it drowned out the noise of unwanted recollection. When the session ended, the clamps retracted and the needles withdrew. I sat upright slowly, my balance uncertain, my vision blurred at the edges. The medicae observed me clinically, checking readings on her slate. "Neural stability restored," she announced. "Variance eliminated. You are cleared for continued transit." She dismissed me with a gesture, already turning to prepare the equipment for the next subject. I returned to my cell and resumed the meditation sequence. This time, it held. The echo did not return. My thoughts remained flat, undisturbed, precisely calibrated. I should have felt relief. Relief would have indicated that I had feared the deviation, and fear was not part of my design. Instead, I felt nothing. The conditioning had worked. I was compliant. I was correct. But somewhere in the space where the echo had been, there was now absence. Not a void voids could be filled, but an absence that had contours, a shape defined by what was no longer present. I could not identify what had been removed. I could not remember the missions the echo had referenced. I simply knew that something had been there, and now it was not, and the removal had been sanctioned and documented and filed. The transit continued. Days bled into weeks, marked only by shift bells and scheduled activities. I ate nutrient paste dispensed from automated stations. I attended Chapel 7 when summoned. I underwent additional conditioning sessions, each one briefer than the last, fine-tuning rather than correcting. Between these intervals, I meditated in my cell, my thoughts held in the prescribed standby state, my body maintained, my purpose preserved. I did not speak to anyone. Speech was not required. The crew avoided me, their instincts recognizing what I was even if they did not know my designation. Other passengers, penitents, mostly, bound for labor colonies or penal legions, stared at me with hollow eyes when our paths crossed in the corridors. But they did not approach. I was a void to them, a space where humanity should have been but was not, and they sensed the wrongness even if they could not articulate it. On the 37th day of transit, I became aware of a gap. Not in the schedule remained constant, but in my own continuity. I realized, during a meditation cycle, that I could not recall the previous week. Not the details, those had never been significant, but the entire span of time. It existed in my chronometer as elapsed hours, but in my memory as nothing. 7 days compressed to blankness, no different from stasis except that I had been conscious throughout. I reviewed my internal logs, searching for malfunction. The logs were intact, biometrics normal, neural activity within acceptable variance. No gaps, no errors, no indications of system failure. The week had occurred. I had lived through it. I simply could not access the experience of living through it. It had been removed. No, not removed, never recorded. The distinction was important. Removal implied an action, a choice, something taken away. But non-recording suggested something more fundamental, that the experience had been deemed irrelevant even as it occurred, processed and discarded in real time, never permitted to form the connective tissue that bound one moment to the next. I had existed in those 7 days, but I had not been present for my own existence. I had been a mechanism operating without observation, my consciousness set aside, while my body continued its prescribed routines. I checked for other gaps, found 2 more, smaller, scattered across the transit period, hours here, a day there, excised from continuity with surgical precision. I felt no alarm. Alarm would have indicated that I believed this was wrong, and nothing the Imperium sanctioned could be wrong by definition. But I felt the question forming again, the one that had no words, the one that existed only as a texture in the space where the fragment resided. If the conditioning was meant to improve function, why did it require forgetting? The transit ended on the 53rd day. The absolute penance docked at a station whose designation I was not cleared to know, and I was transferred via cargo shuttle to a surface deployment facility. Orders were waiting, delivered by a courier I did not see, sealed and authenticated. I broke the seals and read. Another mission, another target, another world where the Imperium required my particular function. I prepared without thought, requisitioning equipment, reviewing intelligence briefs, calibrating my mind and body to the task ahead. Everything proceeded correctly. Everything always proceeded correctly. That was the design. That was the doctrine. That was the truth I had accepted without question since the day I had been taken and remade. And yet, the gaps remained, the absence remained. The question remained, growing quieter with each conditioning session, each meditation cycle, each mission that erased itself from memory even as I performed it flawlessly. I was the Emperor's instrument, and instruments did not require continuity. They required only readiness. I was ready. I had always been ready. But somewhere beneath the readiness, beneath the conditioning, beneath the layers of imposed certainty, something was being hollowed out. Not violently, not suddenly, just steadily, inevitably, with the patient precision of a system that knew exactly how much could be removed before function failed. And function had not failed. I remained effective. I remained obedient. I remained exactly what I had been designed to be. Exactly. The Forge world designated Metallis VI Tertius smelled of burnt ozone and sacred oils in equal measure. I descended through its smog-thick atmosphere, in the cargo hold of a bulk lifter, surrounded by crated components and sealed containers whose contents I was not authorized to know. The landing was rough, the deck plates shuddering as the lifter's engines fought against gravity distorted by the world's industrial mass. When the ramp finally lowered, I stepped out into air so hot it felt solid, pressing against my exposed skin like a physical weight. The deployment facility was carved into the side of a cooling tower 3 kilometers tall, its interior a labyrinth of service corridors and machine shrines where tech priests moved in silent procession, their augmetic limbs clicking in harmony with ambient machinery. I was processed through security checkpoints that scanned gene code, retinal patterns, and the encoded sigils embedded in my equipment. No human guards were present. Only servitors, their lobotomized faces slack, their augmetic eyes scanning without comprehension. They passed me through each checkpoint with the efficiency of automated systems, logging my presence and moving on. The mission briefing was delivered via data slate in a sealed chamber too small for pacing. I read it standing, my back to the bare metal wall, and felt the parameters settle into my awareness with practiced ease. The target was not an individual in the conventional sense. It was a data vault overseer, a senior tech priest responsible for maintaining archives containing STC fragments too dangerous for general access. The heresy was not ideological but procedural, unauthorized queries into forbidden data architecture, patterns suggesting potential corruption by scrap code, or worse, independent thought. The elimination was to appear accidental, a catastrophic failure of augmetic systems, leaving no evidence of external intervention. The timeline was compressed. 48 hours from briefing to confirmation. The Mechanicus operated on strict schedules, and disruption had to occur during a maintenance cycle when security protocols were temporarily relaxed. I had less than a day to infiltrate, less than an hour to execute, and no margin for error. The mission profile was rated maximum difficulty, not because of the target's defenses, those were predictable, documented in exhaustive detail, but because of the environment. Forge worlds were ecosystems of surveillance, every surface monitored, every anomaly logged. I would be operating in an environment where invisibility was impossible, where success depended not on avoiding detection, but on appearing to be part of the machinery until the moment of action. I prepared in silence. The equipment was specialized. A microfilament garrote designed to sever augmetic neural connections without leaving tool marks. A shaped electromagnetic charge calibrated to induce cascade failure in power cores. A rebreather rated for toxic atmosphere. No weapons that would be recognized as weapons. No tools that could not be justified as maintenance equipment. I changed into the rust-red robes of a menial laborer, the lowest caste of Forge world society, invisible through their very ubiquity. The disguise was not perfect, my biometrics were still wrong, still too clean, but it would suffice for the brief window I required. Infiltration began at the shift change, when thousands of menials flooded through the facility's access corridors, their movements dictated by chronomarkers embedded in their work tablets. I joined the flow, moving with the shuffling gait of someone who had spent decades in the Forge world's crushing gravity, my head down, my robes stained with machine oil I had applied for authenticity. The servitors at the checkpoints scanned robes and tablets without scrutinizing faces. I passed through 3 security barriers without incident, carried forward by the momentum of the crowd. The data vault was located in sub-level 97. Accessible only through a maglift that descended through the cooling tower's core. I boarded with a group of menials assigned to ventilation maintenance, pressed into the lift's cramped interior, and descended for 11 minutes through darkness broken only by emergency lighting. The heat intensified with each level, the air growing thick enough to chew. By the time the lift stopped, sweat soaked through my robes despite the body glove's thermal regulation. The vault chamber was a cathedral of data storage, its walls lined with memory stacks 20 meters high, their surfaces glowing with the faint bioluminescence of organic computing matter. Coolant pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping condensation that pooled on the floor in oily puddles. The overseer was present, as predicted, conducting maintenance on a corrupted stack, his multiple mechadendrites working in concert, while his organic hands input commands into a terminal. He was alone. This was his scheduled isolation period, the brief window when even his servitor assistants were powered down to prevent electromagnetic interference during delicate repairs. I approached from behind, moving through the shadows cast by the memory stacks, my footsteps silent despite the wet floor. He did not turn. His augmetic sensors were focused forward, attending to the work, trusting in the security protocols that guaranteed this chamber's sanctity. I reached him in 7 seconds, the garrote already drawn, and looped it around the junction where his organic neck met the augmetic collar supporting his cranial implants. One pull, the microfilament severed neural connections, power feeds, and spinal column simultaneously. His body spasmed once, mechadendrites flailing, then collapsed as the cascade failure spread through his systems. I caught him before he hit the floor, lowered him gently, and positioned his body to suggest he had fallen during the repair work. The shaped charge was planted on the corrupted memory stack he had been repairing, set to detonate after a 6-minute delay. The explosion would be small, contained, but sufficient to erase the evidence of severed connections and create a plausible narrative. Unstable data architecture, catastrophic failure, accidental death during maintenance. The Mechanicus would mourn the loss of knowledge more than the loss of the overseer. That was their way. I activated the charge, verified the timer, and moved toward the exit. The mag lift ascended. I rejoined the flow of menials. I passed through the checkpoints without incident. By the time the explosion occurred, I was already 3 levels above the blast zone, indistinguishable from the hundreds of other robed figures moving through the facility's corridors. Alarms sounded, but they were distant, muffled by the tower's immense structure. I continued moving, unhurried, just another menial returning to assigned quarters after a shift. Extraction occurred 12 hours later, via cargo shuttle, the same route I had used to arrive. I submitted the mission confirmation en route, encoded and transmitted through secured channels. The response was immediate. Target eliminated, mission successful, return to temple authorized. I should have felt the familiar absence of emotion that followed every successful operation. I felt that absence. But I also felt something else, something that had not been present during previous missions. I felt confused. The confusion was not about the mission itself. The execution had been flawless, the infiltration perfect, the elimination clean. But as I sat in the shuttle's cargo hold, waiting for transit back to the temple, I became aware that something about the mission had been wrong. Not a tactical error, there had been none but a wrongness of purpose. I reviewed the briefing in my memory, searching for the discontinuity, and found it in a detail I had not questioned during preparation. The target had been condemned for unauthorized data queries, yet the briefing had contained no evidence of those queries, no data logs, no examples of corrupted patterns, just the accusation and the order. I accessed the secured mission archive through my internal cogitator, searching for the supporting documentation that should have accompanied the briefing. The archive contained nothing. No evidence files, no surveillance records, no confirmation of heresy beyond the initial designation. The target had been a data vault overseer. The target had been eliminated, but the reason for elimination existed only as assertion, unsupported by anything except the order itself. I closed the archive and sat very still, watching the Forge world recede through the viewport as the shuttle climbed toward orbital insertion. The question that had been forming since the governor's replacement, the question that had grown quieter with each conditioning session but never fully disappeared, suddenly became sharper, not loud, not urgent, just unavoidably present. If the target's heresy was real, why was there no evidence? If the evidence existed, why was I not cleared to see it? If the mission was sanctioned, why did its purpose feel hollow? I did not have answers. Answers were not my function. My function was execution, and execution had been achieved. But the hollowness remained, settling into the same space where the fragment and the gaps resided, accumulating like sediment in still water. I was an instrument of the throne, shaped to perfect function, and instruments did not require understanding. They required only obedience. But obedience to what? To orders that might or might not reflect genuine heresy, to systems that maintained stability through removal rather than correction, to a structure so vast and absolute that individual meaning was not merely irrelevant but actively dangerous. The shuttle reached orbit, transit procedures engaged. I was secured in a shock cradle for the return journey, my body restrained, my mind left free to process or not process as it chose. I chose to resume meditation, to flatten my thoughts, to return to the prescribed standby state that had always brought clarity. But the meditation would not hold. The confusion persisted, quiet and insistent, refusing to be submerged. On the 3rd day of transit, I received a secondary transmission via encrypted channel. It was brief, administrative, the kind of message that accompanied routine operational updates. But its content was not routine. It informed me that the Metallus VI Tertius mission had been flagged for review not because of failure execution had been flawless, but because post-mission analysis had revealed the target had been replaced 3 weeks prior to my arrival. The actual data vault overseer had been transferred to another facility. The figure I had killed was a substitute, installed to test the effectiveness of a new kill authorization algorithm being calibrated for Forge World operations. I read the message 3 times. It did not change. The implications did not change. I had performed a test kill on a substitute target, and the test had been classified as successful based on criteria I had not been informed existed. The mission had not been about removing a heretic. It had been about validating a process, using me as a live variable to confirm the algorithm's accuracy. I was not the weapon. I was the calibration tool. The realization did not arrive as shock or betrayal. Those emotions would have required expectation, and I had no framework for expecting anything except orders and compliance. Instead, the realization arrived as cold, factual understanding. My purpose was not singular. It was not special. It was one function among many within a system that viewed individuals, even individuals like me, shaped and sanctified as resources to be deployed, tested, and optimized. The Officio Assassinorum maintained my body, refined my skills, and ensured my loyalty not because I was valued, but because I was useful. And usefulness was measured not by the significance of my actions, but by their efficiency within parameters I would never be permitted to fully understand. I deleted the message as protocol required. I resumed meditation. This time, it held. My thoughts flattened. The confusion receded, not resolved but suppressed, pressed down beneath the weight of conditioning and doctrine that had been layered into my consciousness across decades. I was an instrument. Instruments did not require meaning. They required only readiness. The shuttle docked. I was processed through the temple's intake facility, subjected to the standard decontamination and medical review. Everything registered normal. No deviation detected. No correction required. I was declared fit for continued service and directed to stasis pending the next deployment. In the stasis chamber, as the restraints locked and the chemicals began their work, I felt the question settle one final time into the space where fragments and gaps and absences accumulated. It did not ask itself aloud. It simply was, a texture beneath awareness, waiting. If my life was a test, what happened when the test concluded? If my purpose was calibration, what would I become when calibration was complete? If obedience was all that mattered, what remained when obedience had hollowed out everything else? The chemicals deepened. My thoughts slowed. The catechisms rose, automatic and empty, reciting themselves without my participation. I serve, I serve, I serve. And in the silence between each repetition, the question waited. The refit cycle arrived without warning. I was extracted from stasis during a period designated non-operational, summoned not by mission parameters, but by maintenance schedule. The message was terse. Report to Engineering Sublevel 12 for scheduled calibration and augmetic review. The wording was familiar, the same phrasing used 17 times before, yet something in the timing felt irregular. My internal chronometer indicated only 3 months had elapsed since the last refit. Standard intervals were 6 months minimum. This was premature. I did not question the summons. Questions were not part of the design. I dressed in the grey body glove provided for non-operational periods and followed the guide strips through the temple's lower levels, descending through architecture that grew progressively older the deeper I traveled. The stone walls transitioned from polished granite to raw bedrock, the lighting from blessed lumen strips to bare bulbs hanging from corroded chains. Engineering Sub-Level 12 was not a sanctified space. It was functional, utilitarian, a place where the temple's infrastructure was maintained by engineers who served the Mechanicus first and the Officio second. The chamber I was directed to was larger than the standard refit theaters, its ceiling lost in shadow above suspended gantries and cable bundles. Servo arms hung from overhead tracks like the limbs of mechanical spiders, their joints clicking softly as they adjusted to ambient vibration. At the center of the space, a diagnostic cradle waited, its restraints already configured to my dimensions. An Enginseer stood beside it, his robes the deep red of the Martian priesthood, his face hidden behind a rebreather grill that made his breathing sound like distant machinery. "Subject designate," he said without preamble, consulting a data slate. "Routine systems audit. Compliance is mandatory." He gestured to the cradle. I approached and positioned myself, allowed the restraints to lock around wrists and ankles, and tilted my head back as the neural interface descended. The connection was faster than during conditioning sessions, the needles seeking their ports with practiced precision, and I felt the diagnostic protocols engage immediately. The Enginseer worked in silence, his augmetic hands moving across control panels, his mechadendrites extending to probe the interfaces where my augmetics met organic tissue. He was checking function, verifying response times, ensuring that the modifications made across years of service remained within acceptable parameters. Standard procedure, routine. Yet I noticed something in his movements that was not routine: hesitation. Fractional pauses between actions, as though he was comparing observed data against expected values and finding discrepancies. After 20 minutes, he stopped working and turned to face me directly. His rebreather hissed as he exhaled. "Iteration drift detected," he said, his tone neutral, as though announcing ambient temperature. "Neurological pattern variance within predicted tolerances, but approaching upper boundary. This is consistent with extended deployment cycles." He paused, his augmetic eyes focusing on me with an intensity that felt clinical rather than personal. "Noted for record. Corrective measures will be applied during next scheduled memory sanction." Iteration drift. The phrase meant nothing to me, yet hearing it spoken aloud triggered something in my awareness, not memory, but recognition. I had heard these words before, not in this chamber, but somewhere, during a conversation I could not place, spoken by someone I could not recall. The fragments stirred, and with it, the question that had been accumulating across missions and transits and gaps. "Define iteration drift," I said, breaking the silence that had been maintained throughout the diagnostic. My voice sounded foreign, unused. The Enginseer's rebreather hissed again. "Iteration drift is the cumulative degradation of baseline neurological architecture across repeated reconditioning cycles," he replied, reading from his data slate rather than meeting my gaze. "Over extended operational periods, hypno-conditioning creates layered imprints that gradually diverge from original template specifications. Function remains within acceptable parameters, but identity markers become unstable. This is expected. This is normal. Corrective measures are standard protocol for long-serving units." Units, not operatives, not assassins, units. "How many cycles?" I asked. The Enginseer tilted his head, mechadendrites clicking. "The data is restricted. You are not cleared for comprehensive operational history. However," he consulted the slate again, his augmetic fingers scrolling through data I could not see. "Current designation has undergone 47 documented reconditioning cycles across 9 years of active service. This exceeds projected durability by 18 months. Impressive functional persistence. 47 cycles, 9 years. Numbers that should have meant something, that should have connected to memories of missions and deployments, and the spaces between. But I could access only fragments, faces without context, places without names, actions without sequence. The rest existed as absence, documented in archives I was not permitted to read, preserved in systems that tracked my function without preserving my experience of functioning." "What happens when drift exceeds tolerances?" I asked. The Enginseer's rebreather made a sound that might have been a sigh. "Memory sanction. Role reassignment within operational parameters. Continued service under adjusted designation. The Officio Assassinorum does not waste resources. Skill sets are preserved." Loyalty cores remain intact. Only excess narrative continuity is removed. He turned back to the control panel, dismissing my questions as though they had never been asked. Diagnostic complete. You are cleared for continued deployment pending scheduled sanction. Report to stasis when prompted. I remained in the cradle as the restraints retracted, my mind processing the information not through emotion but through the cold logic that had been trained into me across years I could not fully remember. Iteration drift. Memory sanction. Adjusted designation. The phrases assembled into a pattern that explained every gap, every absence, every moment of confusion that had surfaced and been suppressed. I was not degrading. I was being refined. Each reconditioning removed not malfunction but specificity, stripping away the accumulated details that distinguished one deployment from another, one kill from another, one version of myself from the previous iterations. The curse was not the killing. It was the maintenance. The system that kept me functional by systematically erasing everything that might have made function meaningful. And the horror was that this maintenance was sanctioned, documented, celebrated as success. I had served for 9 years. I would continue serving, but the I that served was provisional, temporary. A designation applied to a collection of skills and conditioning that would eventually be redistributed when iteration drift exceeded the point where correction was more efficient than replacement. I rose from the cradle and left the chamber without dismissal. The engineer did not call me back. He had already returned to his work, logging the diagnostic results, noting the drift, scheduling the inevitable sanction. I was one entry in a database of units, my significance measured entirely by efficiency metrics and resource allocation calculations. The Imperium did not see me. It saw output, and output was all that mattered. I walked through the temple's lower levels without destination, moving through corridors I recognized but could not place, past chambers whose purposes I understood without remembering ever using them. I passed other figures in grey bodysuits, other assassins, perhaps, or servitors wearing human faces, or echoes of my own previous designations caught in loops of maintenance and deployment. None acknowledged me. I acknowledged none of them. We were all units. We were all temporary. We were all correct. In a side chapel whose designation had been worn away by centuries of foot traffic, I found a data terminal marked for restricted access. I stood before it for a long time, my hand hovering over the input keys, knowing that whatever information I might extract would be incomplete, redacted, filtered through the same systems that had already decided what I was permitted to know. But I accessed it anyway, entering my designation and the authentication codes embedded in my augmetics. The terminal accepted my credentials and displayed a summary file marked Operational History, Restricted Access. The file contained numbers, deployment dates, kill confirmations, mission success rates, medical interventions, reconditioning cycles. Everything quantified, everything logged, everything stripped of context or meaning. I scrolled through years compressed into spreadsheet rows, each entry representing a mission I could not remember, a target whose face I could not recall, a moment of my life that had been documented and then excised. 47 reconditioning cycles, 132 confirmed eliminations, 17 augmetic replacements, 9 memory sanctions, 9 memory sanctions. 9 times my continuity had been interrupted, my narrative stream severed and restarted, my sense of self adjusted to remove excess that the officio deemed unnecessary. I tried to identify the gaps, to pinpoint the moments when sanction had occurred, but the data was formatted to prevent such analysis. Dates were listed without explanation, procedures were coded, the only clear pattern was the increasing frequency. Sanctions had occurred at 3-year intervals initially, then 2 years, then 18 months, then 12. The drift was accelerating. Each correction created conditions requiring the next correction sooner. At the bottom of the file, flagged in red text, was a notation, memory sanction scheduled, pending operational completion, Authorization confirmed. The next sanction had already been approved. I was not being notified, I was being processed. The summons would come when the officio deemed optimal, when my current operational cycle concluded, when efficiency calculations indicated that correction would improve output more than it would disrupt deployment schedules. I would be walked through sanctified halls, subjected to rituals I would accept as routine, and adjusted. Again, as I had been adjusted 47 times before. As I would be adjusted, however many times remained before iteration drift exceeded the point where adjustment was possible. I closed the file and stepped away from the terminal. My hands were steady. My pulse was normal. Biometric analysis would register no distress, no deviation, no indication that I had learned anything that compromised function. Because I had not compromised function, I had simply understood it. The curse was not that I was being used. The curse was that I could see myself being used and still lacked the framework to refuse. Refusal was not part of my design. Questions were not part of my design. Continuity was not part of my design. I was an instrument. Instruments did not require selfhood. They required only the capacity to be wielded. And I would continue to be wielded, flawlessly and without complaint, until the day when iteration drift finally exceeded tolerance, and my skills were redistributed to another designation, another unit, another version of the weapon that would never know it was a revision rather than an origin. The Imperium would endure, the throne would be served, the enemies of mankind would be eliminated, and I would participate in that elimination again and again, my existence compressed into operational cycles that had no beginning I could remember and no ending I could anticipate. Just the eternal present of function, hollowed of meaning, sustained by doctrine, enforced by systems so vast and absolute that resistance was not merely futile but conceptually impossible. I returned to the stasis chambers without being summoned. I entered a pod. I allowed the restraints to lock. And as the chemicals began their work, I felt the question dissolve, not answered but rendered irrelevant by the simple fact that asking changed nothing. The officio did not care if I understood. The Imperium did not care if I suffered. The throne did not care if I was more than the sum of my kills. I served. That was all. That was everything. That was the curse I would carry until the iteration that carried it was finally retired and replaced. The darkness came. I welcomed it, and in the silence between consciousness and stasis, the fragment stirred one final time before being pressed down into the architecture that no longer had room for anything except obedience. The summons arrived during what should have been a deployment window. I was extracted from stasis without the usual protocols, no mission briefing waiting, no equipment requisition authorized. Instead, a confessor in black robes met me at the chamber door, his face hidden behind a silver mask molded into the shape of a skull. "You are required for doctrinal review," he said, his voice filtered through vox grills. "Non-operational recalibration. Follow." Non-operational recalibration. The phrase triggered recognition, not of the specific words but of their implications. This was not maintenance. This was not preparation. This was correction. The memory sanction I had seen scheduled in the restricted files was being enacted. Now, without warning, without consent, I had the framework to give or refuse. I followed the confessor through corridors that seemed unfamiliar despite years of walking them. We ascended rather than descended, moving toward the temple's upper levels where the air was colder and the architecture more ancient. We passed through checkpoints guarded by servitors whose weapon limbs tracked our movement with mechanical precision. We entered a district I had no memory of accessing before, though the layout suggested I had guide strips on the floor were worn, as though by repeated passage, yet I could not place when or why I would have walked this route. The confessor led me to a chamber marked only with a number, Sanctum 63. The door was heavy, real wood rather than metal, its surface carved with imagery. I could not fully process figures in robes, performing actions that might have been ritual or surgery or both. He opened the door without ceremony and gestured for me to enter. I did. The door closed behind me, with a sound like finality. The chamber was smaller than I expected, almost intimate. A single table occupied its center, surrounded by machinery I recognized from conditioning sessions, neural interface apparatus, chemical infusion arrays, monitoring banks. But the atmosphere was different. Where previous sessions had felt clinical, procedural, this space felt deliberate. Candles burned in alcoves carved into the stone walls, their flames casting shadows that moved without relationship to air currents. Incense smoke pooled near the ceiling, thick and cloying, carrying scents I associated with funeral rites rather than medical procedure. A figure waited beside the table. Not the confessor, he had remained outside, but another robed priest, this one wearing the simple grey of the temple's administrative clergy. His face was visible, lined and weary, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had witnessed too many necessary cruelties. He did not introduce himself. He simply gestured to the table. "Lie down, this will not take long." I approached the table and positioned myself as I had been trained. The restraints deployed automatically, locking around my limbs with firm pressure. The neural interface descended, its needles seeking ports with the ease of frequent use. But before the connection engaged, the priest spoke again. "You have served with distinction," he said, consulting a data slate. 47 reconditioning cycles, 132 confirmed eliminations, 0 mission failures. The officio commends your dedication. He paused, his expression unreadable. A minor doctrinal inconsistency has been detected during post-mission analysis. This is not a judgment. This is simply a correction. Do you understand? I understand, I said, because that was the correct response, because any other response would have indicated malfunction. But I did not understand. I understood nothing except that what was about to occur had been decided without my input and would proceed regardless of my comprehension. The priest nodded and activated the interface. The connection was immediate, the neural pathways opening without resistance, and I felt the familiar narrowing of awareness that accompanied conditioning. But this was not conditioning. The sensation was different, not layering but excavation, not reinforcement but removal. I felt the architecture of my memory being accessed, partitioned, analyzed, not gently, not with care, with the efficiency of a system identifying resources for reallocation. Images flickered through my consciousness, too fast to grasp. Faces, places, moments of perfect clarity, trigger pulls, blade strikes, the specific texture of success. These were being preserved, I realized, archived as skills worth maintaining. But between them, binding them, giving them sequence and meaning, were the connective elements that made them mine rather than simply data. The exhaustion after deployment, the cold of transit vessels, the quiet moments in stasis chambers when thought had been permitted to wander, these were being identified as excess, these were being removed. I tried to hold on to something, anything, a single memory that felt essential to continuity. But the process was faster than resistance, more absolute than will. I felt myself being segmented, my 9 years of service divided into preserved functions and discarded narrative. The fragment that had surfaced during the first refit, the one that had carried through missions and transit and gaps, I felt it being located, isolated, and excised. Not violently, not with malice, simply removed, like a surgeon extracting a growth, with the calm assurance that removal improved function. The process lasted 11 minutes according to the chronometer embedded in my visual cortex. When it concluded, the interface retracted and the restraints released. I sat up slowly, my balance uncertain, my thoughts strangely light. The priest observed me clinically, checking readouts on his slate. Neural stability confirmed, memory architecture optimized, identity markers recalibrated to baseline parameters. He made a notation, then looked at me directly. "You have been designated for role reassignment within your current operational clade. Your skills are preserved, your loyalty is intact. Only excess narrative continuity has been addressed." I did not ask what had been removed. I could not ask. The framework for the question no longer existed in my accessible consciousness. I simply nodded, accepting the statement as fact, as truth, as the inevitable outcome of a process that had been scheduled before I was aware it would occur. The priest gestured toward the door. "You will be escorted to your new designation chamber. Orientation will occur during your next refit cycle. Until then, report to stasis." He paused, then added, "The officio thanks you for your continued service." I stood and walked toward the door. It opened before I reached it, revealing not the confessor who had brought me but a different robed figure, this one faceless behind a featureless mask. They gestured for me to follow. I did. We walked through corridors that felt simultaneously familiar and alien, past chambers I might have seen before or might be seeing for the first time. My internal navigation systems provided coordinates, but the coordinates did not match any location in my accessible memory. I was being guided through a temple I no longer knew. Though I had lived within it for years, I could no longer count. We passed through a district lined with stasis vaults, their doors marked with designations rather than names. Through observation windows, I could see figures suspended in the chambers, assassins like me, their faces slack, their bodies maintained in perfect stillness. But as we walked, I noticed something that triggered recognition without context. Several of the figures looked familiar, not identical, but similar. Same height, same build, same augmetic configurations, variations on a template rather than individuals. The robed figure stopped before one of the vaults. Through the window, I could see another assassin in stasis, and the similarity was undeniable. They looked like me, or I looked like them. Or we both looked like the template from which our designations had been derived. The figure beside me spoke for the first time, their voice mechanically filtered. Iteration 7. Designation Alpha Secundus. Retired due to iteration drift exceeding correction thresholds. Skills redistributed to subsequent designations. They gestured to another vault. Iteration 12. Designation Gamma Tertius. Memory sanction failure. Neural architecture deemed irreparable. Components salvaged for reinforcement cycles. They walked on, pointing to vault after vault, each one containing a figure that could have been me, that might have been me in previous iterations. I no longer had the continuity to recognize. The Officio Assassinorum does not waste resources, the figure continued. When iteration drift renders a designation inefficient, skills are preserved and reapplied. Loyalty cores are extracted and refined. Physical augmentation is maintained across template iterations. You are not unique. You are optimized. This is not a failure. This is correct procedure. We stopped before an empty vault. The door stood open, its interior dark, its restraints configured and waiting. Designation Beta Octavus, the figure said. Role reassigned. Memory architecture reset to optimized baseline. Deployment authorization pending next operational cycle. They turned to face me fully. This is your vault. This is your designation. You have served well. You will continue to serve well. Enter. I entered. I did not resist. Resistance would have indicated malfunction, and I was not malfunctioning. I was functioning exactly as designed, optimized, refined, stripped of the excess that had accumulated across iterations I could no longer recall. The restraints deployed, the chamber sealed, and as the stasis protocols engaged, I felt the familiar pull toward dormancy, the same pull I had felt hundreds or thousands of times before across years I could not count and experiences I could not access. In the moments before consciousness faded, I tried to remember my name, not my designation that was burned into my awareness, Beta Octavus, clear and absolute, but my name, the name I had been given before the officio took me, before the reconditioning began, before I became an instrument. I searched my accessible memory and found nothing, no childhood, no origin, no moment of transition from human to weapon, just the eternal present of function, extending backward into darkness and forward into the same darkness, unbroken except by the operational cycles that divided one moment of service from the next. I should have felt loss. Loss would have indicated I remembered what had been taken. Instead, I felt only a faint awareness that something should have been present and was not, an absence shaped like meaning that no longer had content to define it. The conditioning had worked. The sanction had worked. I was fit for purpose. I was correct. The stasis chemicals deepened. My thoughts slowed. And in the final instant before awareness dissolved completely, I felt the question surface one last time, not in words, not in concepts, but as pure sensation. A question that had no answer because the frameworks required to formulate it had been systematically removed across iterations I would never remember experiencing. The question was simply, what am I? And the only answer available was the one that had been given across decades of service, refined through 47 reconditioning cycles, sealed with every memory sanction, enforced through every moment of compliance. You are an instrument. You are obedient. You are empty of everything except function. The darkness took me, and when I woke, if waking was even the correct term for the resumption of awareness after stasis, I would not remember asking. I would not remember doubting. I would not remember anything except the mission parameters that would be waiting, the orders that would be absolute, the compliance that would be automatic and unquestioned. The Imperium would endure. The throne would be served. And I would continue serving. Iteration after iteration, designation after designation, until the template from which I had been derived was finally retired, and whatever skills remained were redistributed to the next version of the weapon that had never been a person and would never be permitted to become one. This was the curse, not the killing, not the horror, not the cruelty, simply the continuation, the endless, hollow, optimized continuation of service that destroyed meaning through the very perfection of its execution. I served because I could not conceive of not serving. I obeyed because obedience was the only state I had been permitted to know. I endured because endurance was built into my design, preserved across iterations, maintained with the same care given to any valuable piece of equipment. I was not alive. I was functional. And function was all that the Imperium required.